you to believe that we're still only in chapter 1 of Mark's Gospel. But reading from Mark's Gospel, yet another short account, beginning chapter 1, verse 40. A leper came to him, begging him, and kneeling, he said to him, "If you choose, you can make me clean." Moved with pity, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him, and said to him, "I do choose. Be made clean." Immediately the leprosy left him, and he was made clean. After sternly warning him, he sent him away at once, saying to him, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest, and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded as a testimony to them." But he went out and he began to proclaim it freely and to spread the word, so that Jesus could no longer go into a town openly, but stayed out in the country. And people came to him from every quarter. Thus ends the reading of the word. Thanks be to God. I woke up this morning, very early, with an image of one of those pitching machines. You know, that machine that automatically pitches baseballs at batters for practice. They're made for tennis players as well, and the rate at which the ball is pitched can be sped up. The Lobster Grand Elite 5 tennis machine advertises itself as a machine like none other, which allows the player to personalize shot location, to personalize feed rate, and the spin for each shot in order to customize their practice drills. Baseball batting machines can be found that pitch 2 different kinds of pitches, and one that will even pitch a curveball. You may wonder why the image of pitching machines came into my mind. Comedy films with a scene that features one of those machines gone wild to find the audience its pitches. As I read Mark's stories about the people who keep coming at Jesus faster and more furiously, the image of the pitching machine out of control, its feed rate set too high, came into my mind. Today, Jesus, still a beginner on the job, is confronted by a leper, so-called. You may say, well, Jesus is confronted by lots of lepers and in lots of scriptures. No, not so many. I have some questions to be asked first. For instance, who might be called a leper? Leprosy is really a word describing the condition known as Hansen's disease. In the time of Jesus, and thousands of years before Jesus, anyone with a skin condition might have been called a leper. Skin lesions are the primary external sign of leprosy. If they are left untreated, leprosy can be progressive, causing permanent damage to the skin and the nerves and the limbs and the eyes. People with psoriasis, leukoderma, eczema, or even boils, people with any kind of skin lesion in those days could have been termed lepers. Before their real diagnosis could be made. The biblical laws dictated that such persons had to be observed for as long as 16 days that person in isolation. Anyone with an unusual skin condition could be branded a leper. The priest was the one who made that final diagnosis. And what was the treatment for Hansen's disease in those days? There was no prescribed treatment. So those identified as lepers were isolated in colonies of people with like symptoms. Sort of like cattle with hoof and mouth disease, they were separated from the rest of the herd. This is the disease that Job thought he had, which turned out just to be boils. People who contracted leprosy, it was concluded by the religious authorities, had committed some terrible sin against God, or their ancestors had, and they were cursed. And if they were not cured or cleansed through prayer and sacrifice, they were doomed to atone for their sin by carrying the burden of their disease. This is likely the reason that the word used by the leper is not heal. If you choose, you can heal me. The word used by the leper in Mark's gospel is, if you choose, you can make me clean. The Greek word that describes Jesus' reaction to the leper is splagnitsomai. If you think it's hard to pronounce, you should see how it's spelled. It is translated in a variety of ways, but quite literally describes what you and I would call a gut reaction. A truly visceral response, perhaps to the appearance as well as the request of the leper. Seeing the condition of the leper in rags, his skin bumpy with subcutaneous nodules, up close and personal, may very well have caused the visceral reaction, and one who was still starting out in his work. He has been healing the sick and the possessed, but Mark suggests that this is Jesus' first encounter with a leper. How many of you remember the TV show Quincy, Emmy? Anybody? Jack Klugman was the medical examiner back in the 80s. Very popular show. It was the first medical examiner kind of program. I think you can catch it in reruns about 3 o'clock in the morning. It was the first medical examiner program, and in the opening credits there was always that scene where Quincy was surrounded by a bunch of rookie cops, and as he lifts the sheet on their first dead body, they all start to faint. That is what we mean by a visceral reaction, like the young soldier who swoons at the sight of the needle about to go into his arm. Lepers are not allowed to come near the healthy. They must announce their presence, telling anyone around that they are unclean as a precaution. They are allowed to beg for charity, so this is not a case of the leper being out of bounds. Jesus heals him, and there is this interesting exchange in which Jesus sternly warns the leper not to say anything to anyone, but to go to the priest, as is the instruction of the law, and show himself. Thereafter being observed for some days by the priest, and who will make a determination as to whether the man is in fact clean or still unclean. Why does Jesus want to keep this encounter, this cleansing, a secret? There's much written about why Mark's Jesus strives so hard to stay under the radar. William Reed referred to it in the early 1900s as the Messianic secret, and every seminary student was expected to write a paper on it. is that Jesus' deeds attest to who he is, but his mouth does not. Others make the proclamation, including the unclean spirits, of who he is, but he does not. Circumstances proclaim, but he does not. Every encounter Jesus has with the fast-pitched people in need is not about who he is, but about who he has come to proclaim, to reveal, and to share with everyone who has ears to hear. He doesn't proclaim religious authority, although people call him rabbi. He doesn't claim prophetic authority, though people call him prophet. He doesn't claim great knowledge like the scholars of his day, though people call him teacher. He does not seek to defend his title so much as he seeks to act in the lives of the people he meets. He talks about how he understands the kingdom of God and about God's hopes and dreams for humankind. In this story today, he has a very human response to a man who kneels before him, and a very divine response. The human response is the churning of his gut. The divine response is the decision to heal the man. What is the warning not to tell anyone what has occurred? Is it fear, perhaps, that the eternal pitching machine hurling the needy at him from all corners will escalate even more? Is the secrecy born of a concern that he will be stopped or held back by inquisitions and investigations, confrontations with the religious authorities over what he is doing? Interestingly enough, the only confronters that he has encountered so far are the unclean spirits, and he can silence them more readily than he can silence humans who simply cannot keep from spreading the word, who cannot keep from proclaiming what they have received, witnessed, and heard. Mark tells us that the leper, proclaiming openly and freely what had happened to him and probably never reporting into the priest as instructed, created such an uproar that Jesus couldn't go into a town openly, breezily like before. He might be mobbed. He opts to stay out of the country where people come to him from every quarter. You and I, the readers, become aware, right along with Mark's Jesus, of the groundswell of response to his work. We can feel in this, the very first chapter of Mark's Gospel, the escalating intensity of the Jesus situation. We are meant to feel the tension. This is Mark's intention. Mark wants us to scream at the pages of the text, to shout out to those characters in the text, don't you know? Don't you know who this is? Don't you know that Jesus is the Son of God? He is Jesus, the Christ, the Holy One of God. But they do not have ears to hear us. And we are right where Mark wants us to be, caught up in the tension of knowing the secret and watching the story unfold in which everyone else doesn't. The good news is that there are no restrictions on our telling the story. We have not been commanded sternly to keep quiet about who Jesus is and what he means for our lives. As the body of Christ in the world, we have, like Jesus, had strong, visceral reactions to illness and disease. We have wondered what people did to deserve their illness or disease. We have quarantined and isolated people socially and physically because they were cursed with a disease we did not understand. Leper colonies still exist in the world today, even though the disease is treatable. And the stigmatized diseases like leprosy and syphilis, and typhoid and AIDS still cause a herding instinct, whereby the healthy seek to isolate the stricken. When I graduated from nursing school, we were expected to wear gloves, only for certain procedures. I didn't wear gloves to give a patient a bath, or a back rub, or take their temperature, or give an injection. We didn't even wear gloves to start IVs in the early days when nurses began to be allowed to do that complex procedure. But when AIDS became a threatening presence in the 80s, gloves had to be worn for everything. The threat was palpable, frightening, and some nurses refused to take care of patients suspected of having AIDS. Not only that, the diagnosis of AIDS was to be kept secret. AIDS patients were the modern-day lepers. I remember a particularly angry patient who used her AIDS diagnosis as a weapon. As I attempted to start an IV on her mostly drug-abused, collapsed veins, she pulled her arm away in an attempt to cause me to stick myself with a needle that had already punctured her skin. I did memorial services for friends who died of AIDS, whose families wanted the reason for the person's death kept secret, because they did not want to carry the stigma of the disease. Mark's Jesus invites us to have a compassionate gut reaction for the sake of the lepers of any age. To let go of ignorance and fear. To learn what we can do to choose to heal, not to isolate. You know, 95% of the world is immune to the bacteria that causes Hansen's disease, yet the stigma attached to the disease persists, preventing oftentimes those with symptoms from seeking treatment, which today can be cured, even the most progressive form of the disease. There are still 15 million lepers in the world today. Ignorance, in my opinion, comes from standing in judgment of the one afflicted. Whether we are judging our own affliction or the affliction of others. Jesus' body told him to let go of judgment and move on to forgiveness and healing for all. Jesus' gut reaction to the leper invites us to do the same. To reach out, not in judgment, but always in forgiveness, for the healing of all the people of the world. Amen.
Amen.